Right, let's discuss this further now. We're joined via Zoom by TK Pooe, Public Relations Specialist at the Wits School of Governance. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, before we get into the bilateral relations between South Africa and Singapore, I was wondering if you could just weigh in on what President Cyril Ramaphosa announced during this visit, of course, this afternoon, saying that 6 African countries, including South Africa, will lead this mission to Russia and Ukraine as part of efforts to bring about an end to the conflict there. I mean, this, of course, amid the U.S. allegations that South Africa supplied arms to Russia in Cape Town last year. Just your take?
Well, look, it's not a new thing. If you remember when this initially started, I think hark back to probably November, President Ramaphosa's South African government has always given this offer to say, look, let's really try and mediate this and try and bring some peaceful resolution. It's good that there's 5 other African countries will be joining it, and hopefully it will be taken quite seriously. But we also have to look at the strength of historically what this really means. And by that I mean, if one only has to hark back to what happened in Libya, when a lot of African states said, look, let's intervene before the French and Americans also decided to invade that country of Libya. So the history of it doesn't seem to really augur very well. But I think it is a good start for South Africa and the 5 other African countries to show that, listen, at the end of the day, South Africa has been consistent and other African countries have been consistent, say, look, they want this war to come to an end. So I think we should wish this mission well, and we should hope for a speedy resolution towards finding peace in the Russia-Ukraine battle.
Do you think this will be well received, particularly if you start talking about, the president to Ukraine, Zelensky, in terms of just how the U.S. has brandished South Africa in terms of what is the relationship that is supposed to be neutral as it comes to South Africa when we're talking Russia?
Well, I think for President Zelensky, who tends to probably err on the side of getting in as many partners in the room as possible, I think he would welcome it. But I think the key issue is going to be what are they able to negotiate out of this, and the fact that can they bring both President Zelensky and President Vladimir Putin to the table? If I think the 6 African countries, including South Africa, were to do that, bring President Zelensky and Vladimir Putin to the room and actually just start a conversation, I think that probably would be a major win for the African countries, because as you know, many Western countries are not really trusted by Russia, and maybe African countries might be able to actually bring President Vladimir Putin to the table with President Zelensky. So it might be welcome all around, but it'll be interesting to see what the dynamics are and look exactly how is this going to work out. Where is this going to take place? If it were to graduate beyond simply just going to Kiev and going towards Moscow and actually finding a site for this common agreement to be reached.
All right, let's talk then about today's visit by the Prime Minister of Singapore. With the signing of a number of agreements, in fact, we've been told of investments at around 5 billion rand. Just unpack the relations and the history between the 2 countries.
Well, it goes back to, I think, 1993 is when Singapore established an embassy in South Africa. President Mandela in 1997 visited. He was the first South African head of state to be able to do that. And 10 years later, in 2007, the Singaporean Prime Minister came to South Africa. So it's a relationship that has about 30 years to it, and it's been a long one. I think as your intro stated, look, Singapore has been very instrumental in assisting a lot of civil servants get training. I think the total value of it over the history, I think probably the last 5 years or so, give or take COVID, I think is around 28 billion. But it's a relationship which is quite important to Singapore because outside of South Africa, Nigeria is the largest trading partner for Singapore on the African continent. So it's a relationship which has a lot of room for growth. And if you look at what Singapore excels at, especially when it comes to education and training, they're actually world leaders in this and a lot of the technology. So it's something South Africa can benefit from. And we also have a lot of resources, manufacturing, petroleum and the like, where the South African government, could really find a good partner in Singapore. So it's a relationship which I think at 5 billion to date could actually grow to a bit larger if I think more efforts are made between business and governments of both countries.
When we look at just some of the key areas that would need attention, and then, of course, we're hearing of the communications and digital technology, science and innovation, and water and sanitation. And just when you look at how this country is doing economically, I mean, to what extent will this help and skew things favorably for South Africa?
Well, let's touch on the water thing. You know, Singapore is an island country, but yet, when it comes to its public infrastructure, it's one of the world's leaders in it. And South Africa, and I think it's not a secret any longer that our public infrastructure is in a bit of a chaotic state. So it's a point of learning. But I think what's important, I think what you're touching on, and maybe South Africans alike, because we always hear about these trade deals when you always see these visits, is how do they tangibly, impact somebody who's living in, let's say, Sebokeng or in the Vaal, where public infrastructure, especially water infrastructure, has been dilapidated over 10 years. And I think that's where the South African government historically has always been a bit soft, or I might say a bit weak, in the sense that the failure to translate what other countries do well into the South African context. So my hope is that with this long relationship of over 30 years, now we might be able to see more speedy processes of ways getting experts from Singapore or getting South Africans to actually go to those countries to learn, and actually bringing those best practices into the country and into our government. Because I think that's always been the bit of the bugbear, which is to say South Africa is great at making relationships, such as going to countries like Singapore, learning about how they do the civil servants, but bringing those practices into government, that's where things sometimes are a bit slow. So the hope will be that, look, especially for water infrastructure and also digital communication, you know that Singapore is one of the leading countries when it comes to how they communicate digitally with their citizens and also with the outside world. So it's something our government, South Africa, is starting to really get a bit of a grasp of it. But I think we also needed to do it to the level where we can really say, look, if you're living in rural northern KZN, or if you're living in rural Limpopo, you become more digitally conversant and you're able to actually do that, not just at the point of when you start going to varsity or at the point of where you start, engaging with technology when you're in the city. So those are things I think we can really take from Singapore and start to say, listen, how do we make that part and parcel of the South African relationship with Singapore? And also the great thing about it is it's a country which is also in the Southern Hemisphere. So some commonalities, but I think it's an issue of saying we're a bit more at ease when dealing with people from the South, as the BRICS conferences have also been alluding to.
Absolutely. TK, thank you so much, as usual, for your analysis. Really do appreciate it. TK Pooe is a public relations specialist at Wits School of Governance.